In chapter 16, we're going to be focusing on the autonomic nervous system. So quickly, just an overview of that autonomic nervous system. So it's abbreviated here, ANS. So it's mainly involved in maintaining homeostasis of involuntary activities. So things like heart rate, breathing, digestive, etc. This is the one that's divided or is part of the motor nervous system. So if you remember back to the branches of the nervous system, so there's the somatic motor, that's the voluntary, and then the autonomic motor. So we're focusing on that autonomic motor. And the autonomic motor nervous system is then divided into our sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, as well as the enteric. So we'll focus more on those. So first of all, just the difference between the somatic and autonomic. So with both of these, we have motor neurons and sensory neurons. With motor neurons, some of them are somatic, and they land on the skeletal muscle, again, voluntary control, but then some are autonomic, which is why we're focusing on them here. And they innervate smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, and our glands. So motor neurons can be both somatic and or autonomic, whereas sensory neurons are not subdivided into somatic and autonomic because there's too much overlap in the function. For example, pain receptors that are sensing pain, they stimulate both somatic and autonomic reflexes. So again, voluntary to move your finger back away from pain, but also autonomic to cause things you don't have to think about, like how fast that happens or reflexes that occur. So this is a nice summary table. We will go ahead and kind of hit on all of this, but it's just a great summary table to kind of study to know the difference between our somatic and autonomic nervous systems. And again, most of these we've already hit on. But again, the autonomic, which is where we're focusing in this chapter, again, it says involuntary control. So it's neurons and nerves that are landing on smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and then the glands. So again, involuntary control. So unconscious regulation, but it's influenced by conscious functions. So these target tissues are stimulated or inhibit, so we can activate or inhibit those effectors, those glands or muscles. And then there are two neurons in this series. So the preganglion neuron extends from the central nervous system, so brain or spinal cord, to the autonomic ganglia. And then the postganglionic neuron, the one after that, extends from the ganglion to the target tissue. Now, if we contrast that back to our somatic nervous system to this point, again, somatic lands on the skeletal. This is going to be the more conscious movement of that skeletal muscle. And it's only contracting skeletal muscle. So it doesn't have inhibitory and stimulatory. It only stimulates contraction, whereas the autonomic can do both stimulation or inhibition. And then looking at the neurons of the somatic, only one neuron extends from the central nervous system to the skeletal. So there's not a pre-ganglion neuron and then a post-ganglion. It's just one neuron going from the brain or spinal cord to the muscle. So then if we look at the neuron cell bodies as far as where they're at in the autonomic, that preganglion neuron, those cell bodies in the autonomic nuclei of the cranial nerves, and then also in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. So we'll be looking more at this. Now the postganglionic neuron cell body, again, that's where the nucleus and everything is, that's in a region called the autonomic ganglia. Now the cell body of somatic, in the somatic nervous system, those cell bodies are in the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves and in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. If we look at the number of synapses, autonomic has 2 synapses, first to the autonomic ganglia, then to the target tissue, because again, there's a pre and a post ganglionic nerve or neuron. Whereas there's only 1 synapse with our somatic because there's only 1 neuron that extends from the central nervous system. If we look at myelination, the preganglionic axons of the autonomic are myelinated, but the postganglionic ones, the ones that hit the target, are unmyelinated. And then in the somatic, again, there's only 1 neuron and it is myelinated. The neurotransmitters are also different. That comes back to their stimulation and the response. So acetylcholine is what is used to activate or contract those skeletal muscles. Neurotransmitters in the autonomic, though, the preganglionic neurons, they're going to release acetylcholine, so that's a similarity. But the postganglionic releases either acetylcholine or epinephrine, and we'll talk more about those coming up. And then at the receptor molecule, so those receiving the information, so the autonomic ganglia, those receptor molecules for acetylcholine are called nicotinic. And then the target tissue, so this will be the postganglion neuron, it releases again that acetylcholine, norepinephrine, or epinephrine. Those receptors for acetylcholine are muscarinic. So preganglion release onto those receptors are nicotinic. Whenever the postganglion releases acetylcholine to the target, those are muscarinic receptors. Again, the target tissues that we have here for norepinephrine are either alpha or beta adrenergic. So we'll mention a few of these coming up as well. Whereas again, in the somatic, we only have acetylcholine being released, and those are always nicotinic, which is similar to our what we have from our preganglionic onto the postganglion. And then just a visual to look at the difference here again with the somatic motor neuron, we just have one neuron, so it's going to come out. We're going to have our cell body here, and then that one neuron that extends to the skeletal muscle, so one neuron. Whereas in the autonomic nervous system, we're going to have a preganglionic neuron that's myelinated, so it comes directly from the central nervous system. Again, we have our ganglia here with our cell bodies. It's going to synapse, though, onto a postganglionic neuron. So we see that here. So that postganglionic, so we have that autonomic ganglion where those are cell bodies are collecting. But then that postganglionic neuron, so the pre-synapse is on the post, and then the synapse sends its information, which is unmyelinated, to either the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or those glands. So we have two neurons involved in that pathway. Now if we look at the anatomy of the ANS, again, differentiating, so again, we have the sympathetic division. We'll come back to the parasympathetic and the enteric. So with the sympathetic division, this is also called the thoracolumbar. We'll see why here in a second. So again, those preganglionic cell bodies are in the lateral horns of the spinal cord, on the T1, so the thoracic 1 to the lumbar 2 vertebrae. So that's why it's called the thoracolumbar region. Now the preganglionic axons pass through the ventral roots of what's called the white rama communicans to the sympathetic chain ganglia or collateral ganglia. So again, understanding kind of the movement of these, and we can see the diagram over here. So we have our T1 to L2. This is those preganglionic cell bodies, so the ones coming from the CNS, and then they're going to synapse onto the postganglionic neurons. So again, the names, though, are these regions. Again, we have the white rama communicans. That's where those from the ventral roots are going to go, and they go to that sympathetic chain or collateral ganglia. So we see the collateral ganglia here, sympathetic chain ganglia toward the bottom. Now there are a few different routes that these sympathetic nerves can take, or these axons can take. So some move through spinal nerves. So in this scenario, the preganglionic axons, which are the solid blue lines as we're going through our diagram. So those preganglionic axons synapse to the post, as they all do. Then the post exit through what's called the gray rama communicans. So we just mentioned the white in the previous slide. So this gray ramus or rami communicans region is where those postganglionic nerves exit through. Then they re-enter the spinal nerves to supply the skin and blood vessels of those skeletal muscles. Now we can also have sympathetic nerves. So those are our spinal nerves. We also have sympathetic nerves. Here the preganglion axons synapse with the post, and then they exit through the sympathetic nerves. Okay, so instead of going through that gray ramicommunicants, again, these are going to go through those sympathetic nerves. So our preganglion in the spinal cord, it's going to go through the white ramicommunicans and then onto those synaptic or sympathetic nerves. Now, another one here we have collateral ganglia via splanchnic nerves. So here, the preganglion pass through the chain ganglia without synapsing, and that forms what are called splanchnic nerves. So those preganglion axons synapse with the post ones in a region called the collateral ganglia. So we see it over here. And then the postganglionic neurons send fibers to the target organs, which are called the viscera. All right, now what about innervation of the adrenal gland? So here the preganglionic axons synapse on cells of the adrenal medulla, and those cells secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are hormones that activate physical activity. So now again, kind of coming back to this comparison of our sympathetic now and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So if we look at the location of the preganglionic cell bodies, so again, these are both A and S, so they have a pre and a post ganglion. So in the sympathetic division, those preganglion cell bodies are in the T1 to L2 region, so those lateral horns of the thoracic and lumbar regions. Now in the parasympathetic, that preganglion cell body is going to be in the brainstem and the lateral horns of the sacral regions of the spinal cord. Now what about the outflow from the CNS? Okay, so sympathetic, those preganglion coming from the CNS are coming from spinal nerves, also from sympathetic nerves and those splanchnic nerves. That's what we just went over. Now with the parasympathetic, they can also come from cranial, or those can come from cranial nerves and then pelvic splanchnic nerves. Now what about the ganglia, which is where those cell bodies collect? So in the sympathetic chain, they're along the spinal cord for the spinal and sympathetic nerves, and then they're in the collateral ganglia for those splanchnic nerves. Parasympathetic have a little different, so they have terminal ganglia near the effector organ, so they're going to be close to those glands or to the smooth muscle. What about the number of postganglion neurons for each pre? Okay, so in the sympathetic, we get a lot of divergence, so it has many. So we have one preganglionic neuron that then synapses onto multiple postganglion. Whereas in the parasympathetic, there's less divergence, so it's more kind of a 1-to-1 ratio, one preganglion to 1 or 2 postganglion, so not a lot of divergence. And then finally, if we look at the length of the neurons, so in the sympathetic, the preganglion is pretty short and the postganglion is long, and then parasympathetic is opposite. Okay, so it has a long preganglionic neuron, because again, that ganglia is close to the effector, so it has a long preganglionic to get there and then a short postganglionic neuron. All right, now if we look at the nerve plexus, which is again a group where they're going to the same place, so they may not be doing the same thing, but all the nerves that are going to the same place, like say landing on the stomach, they are grouped into these plexus. And then the distribution of those autonomic nerve fibers. So if we look at the synaptic axons reaching the organs, there are some from different options here. So they can get there through spinal nerves. Those are going to innervate things like our sweat glands and smooth muscles of the blood vessels, to skeletal muscles and skin, so like our erector pili or goosebumps. That's the synaptic axons moving through the spinal nerves. We also have the head and neck plexus, again, so they're all going to the same place. Those also innervate sweat glands. the blood vessels of skeletal and the skin. So those are going in the same places. Then the thoracic nerve plexus, these go to the cardiac and pulmonary regions, so our heart and our lungs. And then we have the abdominopelvic nerve plexus. So this is our celiac, supramesenteric, inferior mesenteric, hypogastric plexus, so the organs of that abdominopelvic cavity. And then here we have just a visual of what we just talked about as far as where those sympathetic neurons are going. So again, sympathetic, thoracolumbar region, so as those nerves are coming off, again, we have the spinal nerves, we have the head and neck plexuses, the thoracic plexus, and the abdominopelvic plexus, and so it's just showing where those are ultimately going so that we can see where they end up landing. All right, now the parasympathetic, so we just covered sympathetic, now moving to the parasympathetic, again, our rest and digest, these reach organs also through 4 options. They're just 4 different ones. So we have the cranial nerves, for example, cranial nerve or oculomotor nerve, so cranial nerve 3, the facial, which is 7, and the glossopharyngeal, which is 9. So some of those parasympathetic axons move through those 3 cranial nerves. They can also move through the vagus nerve and the thoracic nerve plexus. Those are going to go to the heart and lungs, also the esophagus through that plexus. Then we can have the vagus nerve and the abdominopelvic nerve plexuses. This is going to go to the stomach, the gallbladder, the biliary ducts, pancreas, small intestine, the ascending and transverse colon. And then finally, our pelvic splanchnic nerves and the nerve plexus, those are going to the colon, the bladder, and our reproductive organs. And again, a visual here showing those. So again, whether they're going through cranial nerve 3, 7, or 9, or using that vagus nerve and the different plexuses. So we have the pelvic splanchnic nerve here and the plexuses involved with these as well. So just showing how the different ways of them coming off and then landing on their effectors. All right, and then now moving into our sensory neurons. So we've covered our motor. Now what about the sensory? Now again, here we don't have to talk about the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic because they're so intertwined. So our sensory neurons, these axons of the sensory nerves run with the autonomic nervous system axons within the nerves and the plexuses. So they're parts also of the reflex arcs that regulate different organs, and these are going to be transmitting pain and pressure sensations. All right, then our enteric nervous system. So this is made up of nerve plexuses of the walls of the digestive system. So where are those neurons coming from? So sensory that can connect through the digestive tract to the CNS. If you think about the autonomic nervous motor neurons, that connects the central nervous system to the digestive, and then the enteric neurons are confined to those enteric plexuses, so they're staying there. So these are monitoring digestive tract and controlling smooth muscles and glands for the CNS or independently through those enteric plexuses. So what type of enteric neurons do we have? So we have enteric sensory neurons. These are detecting changes in chemical composition of the contents of the digestive tract, also looking to detect the stretch of the digestive walls. Then the enteric motor neurons, these are going to stimulate or inhibit smooth muscle contraction and that gland secretion. And then we also have interneurons that connect neurons together. So those are going to connect the sensory and motor neurons.